and welcome to this edition of the Native News Update on this Thursday, June 2nd. I'm your host for today's program, Paul DeMain. And many of the stories read here can also be found at our website at IndianCountryNews.com. Go there and feast on that and a lot of other stories. And today's stories start with a federal judge has sided with the village of Kaki and reinstated the Clinton-era roadless rule in southeast Alaska's Tongass National Forest, the nation's largest. U.S. District Judge John W. Sedgwick in Anchorage issued his final decision last week, making a March ruling official. Sedgwick found that a Bush administration decision in 2003 to exempt the Tongass from the roadless rule was arbitrary and capricious. The rule protects roadless areas in national forests from commercial logging and road building. Sedgwick's final judgment reinstates the roadless rule in the Tongass while making clear that certain projects and activities can proceed. Those projects include roads and timber removal for energy projects and selling dead or downed wood for fire. Sedgwick did not vacate 3 timber sales authorized under that exemption. He says the decision about that is left to the Department of Agricultural. Former Lander Valley High School basketball standout Tahnee Robinson has been released from the WNBA's Connecticut Sun. The Casper Star-Tribune reports the 5'9" Wyoming native was released earlier last week. The 5'9" native Robinson starred at Sheridan College before going on to be named All-Western Athletic Conference at the University of Nevada and was selected by the Phoenix Mercury with the 31st pick in last month's WNBA draft before being dealt to the Connecticut team. She was the first Wyoming-born player and the first Native American to be a WNBA draft selection. Sun coach Mike Thibault says the players at the guard position are pretty solid veterans and there really wasn't a roster spot for her at this point. A Seneca Nation tribal councilor took the Western New York tribe's concerns over treaty rights to a United Nations forum recently. It was the first time the nation has taken any issues to the international arena. In New York City last week, Councilor Nikki Seneca urged members of the UN's Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues to examine federal and state obligations to honor promises made to the tribes. The Senecas want the UN Forum to come up with recommendations for an international mechanism for resolving treaty-related legal and social disputes. The Senecas in the New York State have been at odds for years over the state's effort to tax cigarettes that reservation smoke shops sell to non-Indian customers. The Senecas say historic treaties protect their businesses from federal and state taxation. And in a related story, a judge this week extended a temporary order preventing New York State from following through with its plans to tax those cigarettes sold on reservations there in New York to non-Indian customers, while she considers the Seneca Nation's challenge to the regulations that would govern collections. The Senecas want Erie County Judge Donna Seawick to throw out the regulations and force the state taxation department to rewrite them, claiming they were rewritten illegally. Seneca attorney Carol Heckman argued that the department didn't follow its own rules in creating them because it didn't consider the negative impact that would the rules would have on the Western New York tribe and its businesses. The hearing didn't address the tribe's long-standing opposition to the tax itself. Seawick said she would issue a written decision within 1 week. Last month, just as Governor Andrew Cuomo's administration was preparing to begin collecting tax on smoke shop sales statewide, anticipating nearly $500,000 a day in revenues, the Senecas won the temporary restraining order now in place. The state plans to tax Native American sales without going into reservations by requiring cigarette wholesalers to pay the sales taxes before they supply reservation stores. Wholesalers would pass along the levy onto tribal retailers who would then have to raise their prices. Spirit Lake Nation prosecutor Joe Vetch says the death of 2 children there are being investigated as a homicide case. The Grand Forks Herald reports that 41-year-old father Travis Du Bois of St. Michael's pled guilty in tribal court on May 31st of public intoxication and reckless endangerment and was sentenced to 2 years and 2 months in prison. Vetch says Du Bois was in an intoxicated condition, was left in charge of the children, and they ended up dead. He says the conviction does not rule out more charges in tribal or federal court in the deaths of the 7-year-old boy and 9-year-old girl whose bodies were found last Saturday. U.S. Attorney Timothy Purton says that only that federal authorities are investigating the case. The remains of hundreds of Alaska Natives stored at a museum were blessed in a ceremony this last weekend to draw attention to the repatriation process. The ceremony was to be held at a park across from the UA Museum of the North of Fairbanks, according to the Daily News Miner there. Jim Whitney, manager of the UA Museum Archaeology collection, said remains began arriving at the museum in the 1920s, largely through private donations and discoveries during excavations. He said the Fairbanks Museum has been working with tribes to return the remains, but none have been returned since the year 2008. Event organizer Candace Childers said the ceremony is meant to draw attention to the 340 sets of human remains still in the museum's possession. Following the ceremonies, a panel discussion was held about the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. Childers said that she also hoped that the ceremony would spur repatriation as various museums in the state. The repatriation process has slowed in recent years, which she attributed to a combination of bureaucracy and lack of information on what those museums hold. The water walkers are arriving and traveling through the Lakoutere Ojibwe Reservation on June 3rd, 4th, and 5th, and the public is welcome to come join them at a community potluck feast on Saturday from 3 until 7 p.m. at the LCO Honor the Earth Powwow grounds. You can get more information about that by calling 715-558-1318 locally at Lakoutere. And their arrival at Lakoutere means that all 4 directions are moving together for convergence here very soon on Friday, June 10th, where they are scheduled to leave Wisconsin Visitor Center. That would be the western, northern, and the southern routes that have come together in the early morning hours, traveling on Highway 2 through Ashland to arrive at the Bad River Reservation at the old Odana Powwow grounds later that day, where their friends and relative supporters are all invited to camp and spend the weekend for a series of events, feast, ceremonies, and speeches on June 11th and 12th. And more information about that can be located on the Bad River Reservation by calling 715-682-7127. So if you're hungry, show up at those water walk feasts here at Lakoutere on Saturday, and next weekend up at Odana on the Bad River Ojibwe Reservation, or B Square there. And that is the latest roundup of news from Indian Country on this edition of the Native News Update. Wanan for joining with us today. Come back again soon.